I grew up in a small town outside Memphis, Tennessee, and it was really a farm community. And my father wasn't a full-time farmer, but he did some farming, cotton and soybeans. I didn't really listen to a lot of music until I was 11 when I started playing the cello. And that was at the school that I attended. There was a music teacher, and she thought I had some musical talent. And I had tried the piano, and I had played a few other instruments because they were laying around. There was a clarinet and a flute and French horn, but nothing really ever stuck until I tried the cello. And the woman who was the music teacher at the school that I went to, she had a Suzuki violin class. But I was a little bit older than those kids. And so she, asked if I wanted to play the violin, and I heard them all, and I said, no, I need something lower. And I liked instruments that were lower. I did play the recorder early on, but I ended up playing the tenor recorder. And so I had always gravitated towards lower sounding instruments, so it seemed natural. And so she said, okay, well, here's a cello, try the cello. And so I did, and it was great. I really enjoyed it. And because she wasn't really a cellist, she then had me go to Memphis State University, and I studied with someone there. And then I was very fortunate, not my very first teacher, but soon after, Peter Spurbeck became my teacher. And because of him is why I still play the cello, really. We did listen to some popular music. I remember when my father got a stereo, it was a really big deal. And he had Wilson Pickett, who was a country guy, and he had some of his records. He also had Herb Alpert and the Tijuana Brass. But I wouldn't say my family was a musical family, even though my mom, we had a piano because had been my mom's, and I think my mom had always wished that she'd become a pianist, but she wasn't really that musical, and so she didn't. But anyhow, so my family, they were very supportive of me being a musician, but it wasn't sort of a natural thing for me to have gone into, considering my family's background. I was exposed to contemporary music fairly early on. A lot of it to do with the cello and just trying to find music to play with my friends, and duets in particular. But then also when I studied with this cellist who taught at Memphis State, there were several composers there, and one in particular, Carl Marsh, who has become actually a very famous arranger and composer himself in the recording industry. And he had me join the union. I was 16, and I played a lot of his music, but then he arranged all this stuff for people like Jerry Lee Lewis and Rod Stewart, and so some really big people. But all I was in the string section, the string background. But it was really great to be exposed to all that. And so I was exposed to like pop and rock and that kind of, not classical, but other kinds of music. And I didn't start composing until I left Kronos, really. I did take a semester of composition at Indiana University, where I went to music school. And I loved my teacher. He was really great. And the reason I started studying with him is because I had been one of the first people in his ensemble, which was a contemporary music ensemble that was started at Indiana University. And and I remember we did 8 songs for Mad King, Peter Maxwell Davies, and that was a really cool thing to do, I thought. And so I developed a relationship with him. His name was Fred Fox. And so then it was like, oh, okay, yeah, I'll take some composition from Fred, but I was terrible. And so I really didn't think I had much ability for that, you know, and I was so focused on, you know, cello. I have my dog Jack here, who's my very faithful companion and music listener. Every once in a while he might bark, but usually it doesn't have to do with an out of tune note, but it might be someone outside on the sidewalk. But this is Jack. I had a string trio that I played in. I went to, you know, I played in the Memphis Youth Symphony, and I had friends from there, and so there was a violist and a violinist, and the three of us would play these trios, but so, you know, so I don't remember playing in a quartet per se, really probably until I went to Indiana, and then I took chamber music almost every semester when I was there, and every time it was a string quartet. So I played quartets quite a bit when I was in college, and you know, we played all different kinds of repertoire. You know, kind of the classic, you know, Beethoven, Haydn, Brahms and stuff, and you know, and then of course we would get together as friends, often and play sextets, you know, like the Schubert Quintet or Brahms Sextet, or, you know, so we would just jam a lot of times, but it would be reading music, and that was a really fun thing to do, so kind of did that a lot. I was only aware of Kronos when Hank joined the group. I'd played in a quartet with Hank at Indiana University because he went there too. And so we had a quartet that we called Gigliani because we used to rehearse and we would just crack up at certain times and we'd have to leave the room. We were laughing so hard. So we decided our name would be the Gigliani. But we had a great time playing quartets. And so then when Hank left Indiana University, he had joined Kronos. So I was aware of that. But when he joined Kronos and came out to San Francisco, I went to Geneva, Switzerland, and I studied with Pierre Fournier. And so I studied a year with him privately, and basically I played some chamber music when I was there with other people, but not any quartets, because there just wasn't that available in my surroundings of people I knew. So we did some other stuff. We did some clarinet, cello, viola stuff, but yeah, so quartets has always been in my consciousness, but, you know, really very seriously, it was only when I joined Kronos. Well, Kronos has all to do with my life and my life as a musician, no question. I joined when I was 22, so right after I finished studying with Pierre Fournier, I got this call from Hank. It was perfect timing because I was thinking, well, I should get a job now, you know. And so I came to audition, and I think largely because I knew Hank and we had worked together, that was very helpful in, you know, having them invite me to join the group. And so it was great, and it was such a great experience. And for 20 years, you know, we played all this music, and I just learned so much being in that group, and from all the people and from all the guys in the group, and even, you know, we go back in the management too, Janet, of course, and Teresa, and all these people who had helped us get to where Kronos is today, you know. So Kronos, you know, is just so much a part of my life. I can't really separate it out, and I have to say the reason then I became a composer is, you know, because I got MS and it became clear that it was just going to be too difficult for me to travel like Kronos traveled. And as hard as it was, you know, I made the decision, and I think everybody also agreed, you know, that it was best for me to leave the group, let them continue. And then, of course, I was faced with, well, what am I going to do? But, you know, I had always had a really big interest in improvisation. And so I started improvising. And I have a very good friend who's a composer who I met through Kronos, Steve Mackey. And Steve said to me, he said, if you start improvising, you're going to start composing. And that's exactly what happened. And because I was so used to written out notation, I would improvise and there would be something that I really liked, and I would notate it. And so it just kind of started from there, really. And I also got some loopers, and that helped me tremendously, electronics. And so in a lot of ways, my early pieces, I sort of feel like, oh, I was kind of recreating a string quartet, you know, because typically I would have 4 parts, you know, and then sometimes 6, and now sometimes I do even more than that, you know, 8 or 10. But at the beginning, it was very interesting how I sort of gravitated to writing 4 parts. You know, I think what David first said to me when he approached me, he said, well, I figure there's nobody else who knows string quartets as well as you do. And I thought about that, and I thought, well, first of all, that was a big compliment, but also, you know, realizing, okay, what did I learn in those 20 years from being in Kronos? And I learned a lot about so many things, but certainly the fact of what a string quartet could really do and what they could produce out of their instruments. And it was not necessarily what we learned in music school. I think we took all those ideas that we learned in music school and just applied them to more contemporary music, modern music. A very good example is, you know, how you're really taught how to use your bow and how to do all these different articulations, and, you know, but then like pizzicato, you know, it was not something that was ever really considered, you know, you just pluck your string. But then in Kronos you realize, oh man, there's a ton of different ways you can pizzicato. After David asked me to write a piece, I thought, okay, what would be the best thing that I could pass on to a young group? And, you know, I thought, well, I really learned all these really cool effects in Kronos and how to make these different sounds out of my instrument. And actually all that has become part of my music. I mean, the way I write music now has a lot to do with the sound and the production of the sound. And so I thought, okay, well, I'll write a piece that sort of addresses a lot of these things I learned and then put them in the piece so that other people can also experiment with those and you know, work with that. And it proved, you know, also impossible because there's just so many things, you know, so I feel like it's just a little sample of stuff, you know, that the piece actually addresses. And I tried to fit as many things in as possible, but it was to be a short piece. Then it's 7 minutes long, maybe 7.5. But so as a result, you know, there's a lot of stuff in there, but there's a lot of stuff that's not. But so I tried to pick certain effects that I had really enjoyed learning in Kronos and, you know, present those. Well, you know, and even from the title of the piece, you know, it's called Knock. And basically it starts out with using the instrument and tapping the instrument to make sound. And that's a very short little section at the beginning, but it sort of represented to me also when I was in the group, we all went through a lot of tough times too. Great times, of course, but then also some really tough times. And it was always, and it was hard knocks. That's, at first I was going to call the piece Hard Knocks, but then I just simplified it to knock. But we did suffer a lot of hard knocks, and I think as a group, we made it through it all, by playing music and, you know, being in the group and supporting each other and having that great support system. But really, it was the music that really got us through all that. So that's how the title Knock came to be. But then, you know, then from there, you know, I was thinking, and I just really what I did was wrote down all these effects that I learned in Kronos that I had really thought are really wonderful sounds too. So not only tapping the instrument, again, there's infinite ways. Look how big my cello is. You know, depending on where you tap on the instrument, you get a different sound. Or what you use, you know, your fingertips or your knuckles or, you know. So that's why I say this is just a little morsel of a big meal out there. But then other things too, like, you know, so then I had a list, and so I had glissando, you know, when you slide up the string. I also had things like ponticello, which is when you play really close to the bridge. Then you can play also behind the bridge, and you get a different kind of sound there. Then there's, what else did I use? Even things then besides sound sort of related effects, there's one part I really like in the piece, which is the very end. And to me, it's got its inspiration from a section of the Ludoslavsky String Quartet, which I had always really enjoyed that piece. And it was really interesting how he wrote this one section. He had all four people playing essentially the same material, but it was slightly displaced. And there was a certain amount of improvisation because you really were expressing your own tempo and your own way of playing this section, but you were all playing it together. And so it was very interesting how it overlapped. And so at the end of my piece, Knock, I have a similar sort of thing. I don't know that anybody else would ever notice it. Kronos, when I worked with them, they understood exactly what I was talking about because, of course, we played that piece by Ludoslavsky. So, but then that's not necessarily a technique on my instrument, but it's certainly a sort of compositional technique. I think the most important thing to learn when you approach a new piece is that, you know, everything that you've learned in music school or about music, you know, to express the intention of the composer or express emotion, I think that all is so important. But I think the way to do it is through experimentation. So I don't think there's any one way to play something necessarily. And especially when you're in a group, you know, if you're in a quartet, you know, there's all four people to consider. And all four people should have ideas and communicate that in the group as you rehearse. And so, you know, that's a wonderful thing about a quartet. It's really a community of musicians, you know, and it's not dependent on any one person. It really takes the group as a whole to make the presentation of what you're doing. When Kronos worked with all the African composers, when we did Pieces of Africa, that was a really wonderful experience because, you know, all the composers were, you know, so clear about how each of the four parts were independent, but they were each equally significant. You could not take one part away and have the piece make any sense. You had to have all four parts. Whereas in a lot of classical music, you know, you could probably have the first violin part and it would kind of make sense, you know, but you couldn't, you know, it would be easier to take something away in that case than like these pieces of the African composers. It's true, it just wouldn't make any sense at all if you lost one part. So that was a really great revelation for me, I thought, you know. Well, besides composing, especially early on, I really got into sort of the visual presentation of music. And I've done several, what I would call multimedia kind of things. So, you know, I was experimenting with lights and sound and video and sort of combining all those elements. Also, a thing very early on, which was a recreation of Charlotte Moorman's Ice Cello. It was actually called Ice Music for London, but I changed it to Ice Cello. And it was just simply a cello made of ice, which was incredibly beautiful and interesting in itself. But then the only sound was the cello melting and dropping onto the surface below, which was mic'd. And then there was a really great sound guy, Greg Kuhn, who you all know, and he also then manipulated the sound with computers and things. So it ended up being a really beautiful environment, and there was lighting and this incredible sound space that you could, you know, walk around in. So I became very interested in that sort of thing. And then I did another piece, Aria, with Alessandro, same sort of thing where it was a little bit more complicated. But anyhow, that sort of took me on that path for a while. And now I haven't done too many sort of multimedia things like that. I just did a project with a storyteller, though, Charlie Varon, which was also very interesting, and to take the cello and write a score that would make sense behind his story. And so it wasn't like a movie, but in a way more similar to a movie where that you're supporting this other story that's going on at the same time. So I'm very interested in that, this kind of layering of sound and music. My message for musicians would be have a good time, you know, because it's such a great thing to do, to make music and to make music with your friends and to really think about stuff that you're doing and experiment and take it as seriously as you would any other kind of endeavor or any other kind of music. You know, I think early on when I was in Kronos, I think a lot of people didn't really pay attention to playing contemporary music like they would playing Mozart or something like that. And I think that's changed quite a bit. And now that I'm out of Kronos, it's kind of easier for me to say, well, Kronos had something to do with that, you know, really made people realize, hey, you know, this is really great music too and deserves as much attention and consideration as any other kind of music that's out there. So that I think is a really important thing. It's like, you know, take all that you've learned and all your resources available and somehow make that part of your statement and into your music and becomes part of your interpretation.